All right, so we continue on with the Foundation for the Philosophy of Creativity sponsored 8th Creativity Conference on, in this case, Emerson and creativity. And so we have come to the culmination of our mini conference, and I'm pleased to introduce my friend and longtime colleague, Doug Anderson. It's difficult to know what to say about Doug, but what I will say is that I've known him almost longer than anybody outside my own family. That said, that does not mean that we get along. But it does turn out that there are these places of overlap in our history, which is we both love Emerson. And when he needs a bass line and a harmony, I show up. And when I need somebody to talk poetry that seems like philosophy, he shows up. When we were at a conference in New Jersey at Richard Stockton College at SAAP, Doug gave this amazing address. It was on Emerson. And he came out of that and I said, there was no philosophy in that, it was all poetry. And he said, that's the nicest thing you've ever said to me. So with that said, I am now going to turn it over to my partner in musical crimes, but not necessarily philosophical crimes, Doug Anderson. Make him feel welcome.
So a little over a century ago in 1909, Spokane was the site of a free speech battle engaged by the Wobblies, the industrial workers of the world. And in that battle came a 19-year-old Irish woman, Irish-American woman from Concord, New Hampshire, and her name was Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. A defender of women's rights and abilities, birth control, and women's suffrage, Flynn found the Wobblies amenable because they included women in the contest for the amelioration of workers' lives. She was moved and motivated by what she had felt and experienced around her. She knew American poverty. She knew cultural exclusion. She knew the lousy conditions of labor. She knew the factory life of New England, in her words, huge gray mills like prisons, barrack-like company boarding houses, long hours, low wages, long periods of slack. You can still see the buildings up there if you go up north of Boston. She says, I saw lard instead of butter on neighbors' tables. And she recalled children without underwear in cold New England winters, a girl scalped by an unguarded machine in a mill across the street from our school. I saw an old man weeping as they put him in the lockup as a tramp. In the sense that both Waldo Emerson and Jimi Hendrix intended, she was experienced. She knew the facts and the feelings of the working poor. At the same time, she was attentive to the spiritual or higher laws that others ignored. Through her experiencing, she sympathetically apprehended, as William James might say, the aesthetic and moral meanings of her world. She was attentive, aware, and awake. Why, she asked, did good, hard-working people suffer so? Why were there rich people who apparently did little but enjoy life, she asked. I have seen, she told Congress, textile workers who wove beautiful woolen fabrics shivering for lack of warm clothing, and coal miners living in cold shacks in company towns and steel towns that were armed camps. I'm just realizing how relevant this is today. She drew inferences and spent her life in activism and writing, or as she saw it, in trying to make things better, trying to bring the actual into line with the ideal. After leaving the Wobblies, she became a socialist and then a communist. And I should be clear that what most people think of as communism today is not what she had in mind at all, or not what the early Communist Party in America was. But she was never a classroom reformer. Her communism was a function of her experiences and her attentiveness to them. On this score, she would pass as an Emersonian scholar and poet. One of the most incomprehensible features of human history and the history of philosophy is what we might call the arrogance of the present. We tend to think that our worldviews are final, as the end game of human history. Richard Rorty remarkably argued that the history of philosophy was nothing but an interesting set of stories written by dead white guys. Others have portrayed this history as, quote, the history of silly ideas. Perhaps, but then Rorty would be the next dead white guy, which he is now. and the others will become the authors of the next silly ideas. Such arrogance suggests that as individuals and cultures, our, in Emerson's words, mean egotisms are alive and well. And Emerson suggests they stand in the way of our self-improvement. The pest of society, Emerson believed, is egotists. There are dull and bright, sacred and profane, coarse and fine egotists. 'Tis a disease that, like influenza, falls on all constitutions. It is a tendency in all minds. Professional philosophy of the last century is but a backwater polis of our larger culture, but its arrogance of the present has known few bounds. And by that I mean the 20th century, although I don't exclude what's going on in the 21st. I've been told on many occasions over the course of my career that philosophers don't do history. This has become more and more of a fact, but it is not a virtue. Philosophers have developed a habit of marshaling arguments to defend things we already wish to believe. In the plumbing trade that I grew up in, we call this backfilling. We like to make experience fit some inherited account of the cosmos, though we remain ignorant of the fact that we inherited it. And this is how we come by what William James called our ancestral blindness. Even more dire is our tendency to create agonistic events concerning things about which we do not actually care. But while this surface professional work fills our journals, we can still drive every thinker, no matter how clever, back to the root vision, and it is there, on Emerson's view, that thinking occurs in its most vibrant form. Emerson's story of self-cultivation and of living and learning generally is about the finding and founding of our aboriginal visions. There are the grounds and the premises, or these are the grounds and the premises, in both senses of these words, upon which we conduct our lives. When I say grounds and premises, this is a pragmatic note, because grounds and premises are where we physically live, but they are also where our thought lives. And if you're a pragmatist, thoughts and places and things merge. They are related. Thus, for Emerson, logic is the procession or proportionate unfolding of the intuition. So here's a pragmatic element in Emerson, or better, here is the Emersonian legacy to be found in pragmatism. The reason we professionals have left philosophy at the place of asking whether our argument goes through, or whether X follows from Y, or in my case, the reason philosophy becomes reduced to reading a text rightly, is that it's easy. We engage in a bogus sense of certainty, unassailable so long as we do not return to the grounds and premises that underlie our deductions and interpretive analyses. We wish, said Emerson, to learn philosophy by rote and play at heroism. But the wiser God says, take the shame, the poverty, and the penal solitude that belong to truth-speaking. Try the rough waters as well as the smooth. Rough water can teach lessons worth knowing. And on my part, rough waters require tough thinkers. Emerson suggests an experimentalism of a sort. For him, a thinker ought to begin by searching for the originary grounds and premises from which she can conduct her life. And that's important as well, because for the transcendentalist as well as for the pragmatist most of the time, philosophy is about the conduct of life. It's not about creating a logical puzzle. It's not about interpreting logical puzzles. It's about how should I live. If we go back to the Greeks, at least in the Western culture, and Confucius in the Asian culture, we will find that that's the case. That's where philosophy begins, and in my view, that's where it should stay. So as he noted in Circles, we are, each of us, always living with the possibility of moving to new grounds and new premises. Experiences presses back on or undermines the ones upon which we now reside. And again, you hear this in the pragmatists, things are always in transition. Friend McDermott always would say, things are in transition, Anderson. Those of you who knew John could hear his voice.
Yes, that's good. That's good.
Emerson's Schelling-like philosophy of nature, in which we humans are both natura naturata and natura naturans, thinking is not so easy. It is neither a shuffle of logical pieces nor a templated act of interpretation or analysis. Thinking is prefatory to these acts, important as they may be in the end. as he asked in his essay, Intellect, what is the hardest task in the world? To think. And Heidegger agreed, by the way, as later on. One hears echoes of this in the writing of Heidegger and Henry Bugby. The aim of this brief essay is not to deny the efficacies of logic, scientific knowing, the rest of what we've come to think of as thinking in the 21st century, but to recall that experimental and creative thinking arises from a fundamental outlook. It rests on grounds and premises, even if these are vaguely articulated and hypothetically held. Emerson's point is that the significance or the truth of these founding premises is enhanced to the extent that we are adept at the art of reception. Always, Emerson wrote, our thinking is a pious reception. The general conditions of the receptive mood for thinking rest on the art of engaging our whole sensory and perceptual apparatus as living organisms in the process of attending to what happens around us, to us, and through us. At the heart of Emerson's thought is an overcoming of the ontological separation of percepts and concepts. As did James and Peirce later on, Emerson suggested that we can perceive both percepts and concepts. This is something that Peirce developed extensively, but it's there in Emerson as well. And all the analytic philosophers I've ever talked to think it's nonsense. So we can perceive both percepts and concepts, both particular things and meanings. For him, the thinker's journey begins in the renunciation of the self of the sort proposed by the post-Socratics and John Cassian. Not a Puritan rejection of self-worth, but a return to humility in which one's care for learning exceeds one's concern for oneself. The art of perception is aided by a genuine love for what is not us, namely nature. As later for Heidegger, caring about what one would know is a key to its giving itself over to us. For Emerson, this attitude of receptivity is one of which we are all capable, even if we haven't the talent to be fully constructive or productive with our ideas. We may have to let poets speak for us, but they can only do so insofar as we recognize in their work the ideas for which we have cared. But if the constructive powers are rare, and it is given to a few men to be poets, or persons to be poets, wrote Emerson, yet every man, person, is a receiver of this descending Holy Ghost, and may well study the laws of its influx. Exactly parallel is the whole rule of intellectual duty. A self-denial no less austere than a saint's is demanded of the scholar. He must worship truth, forgo all things for that, and choose defeat and pain, so that his treasure in thought is thereby augmented. If you read the last paragraph of Peirce's Fixation of Belief, after he's done all his intellectual stuff, he wants to marry the scientific method. He wants to be the knight in shining armor. So you hear that same idea that somehow if you are seeking truth, you actually need to worship truth. And to do that, you need to live a different kind of life. So in his democratic attitude regarding our abilities to be receptive, Emerson foreshadowed Peirce's musement, Muir's aesthetic intuitions, and Bugby's notion of being at home to learn from what is around us. And perhaps Heidegger's Gelassenheit stands in the same tradition. This Emersonian emphasis on receptivity has, I think, much to offer philosophy in the 21st century. At the very least, it provokes us to reconsider what we mean by thinking, reasoning, and inferring. It also provides us an opportunity to get over our inflated conceptions of ourselves as, quote, professional philosophers, and as Michel Foucault suggests, get back to being engaged in discussions of mutual concern and interest as amateur confessors whose aim is at most to make a difference in how someone thinks. For Emerson, as a post-Socratic and a Neoplatonist, philosophy is both highly speculative and, in the end, a matter of conducting our lives. Emerson was not a thin practicalist, but a scholar who took the thickness of experience and thinking seriously. And in his words, the most abstract is the most practical. As I will suggest later, this is in part what I see in the work of Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. Speaking loosely, if one is interested in and good at winning arguments, one should consider the legal profession. The money is there. However, if one is interested in self-recovery and self-cultivation, then a philosophical life might be in order. Only a very few in recent years, Pierre Hadot, Henry Bugby, and perhaps Arnie Ness, have suggested we take philosophy back in this direction. However, Emerson did not press for scholars to fully separate themselves from culture. He had little patience for the transcendentalists who retreated from society merely to engage in criticism. Sniping from nowhere was for him a low-rent pastime. The grounds of criticism must be somewhere as the locus of provocation. One must find, attend to, and live experimentally on one's premises. This requires a different attitude and orientation than does the winning of argumentative contests or the critiquing of others without offering new possibilities. I think that's one of the most interesting things about the current Congress is that they don't legislate. They got nothing positive to say and nothing positive to offer. It's just negative critique from nowhere. For Emerson, the doors of higher laws are always open to all of us, but we must choose to walk through them in an attitude of openness. I don't think anything is clearer to me than that line. They're open to all of us, but we have to choose to walk through them in an attitude of openness. To perceive these higher laws, we must be patient and resist the temptations of calculative thinking. The regular course of study, said Emerson, the years of academical and professional education have not yielded me better facts than some idle books under the bench at the Latin school. What we do not call education is more precious than that which we call so. And those of you who are familiar with Dewey, if you read the opening, the introduction to Democracy and Education, the very first opening is schools don't do it. Right? And your education is happening from the time you're born, and it's happening in experience all the time. And the schools are just one part of that. And Dewey's very clear that we need to be thinking about education in that broader sense. We form no guess at the time of receiving a thought of its comparative value. And education often wastes its effort in attempts to thwart and balk this natural magnetism, which with sure discrimination selects its own. That is all from Emerson. Here is Emerson's moment of democracy. There is a guidance for each of us, and by lowly listening we shall hear the right word. And yet he says no man can learn what he is not preparation for learning, however near his eyes are to the object. For preparation, our preparation for learning begins, in part, with our not getting in the way of ourselves. If I bring my desires, my ancestral blindnesses, and my theories to bear on my doubt, my inquiries will be tainted. I will tend to provide answers before they are actually available, and this is a version of what Peirce calls tenacity. We are always right because the only measure of our ideas is themselves. So we must let our mean egotisms vanish if we are to experience down-to-earth epiphanies and if we are to find our moral, aesthetic, and logical premises. As Emerson warned in his essay Culture, the man runs round a ring formed by his own talent, falls into admiration of it, and loses relationship to the world. It is a tendency in all minds. The goiter of egotism is so frequent among notable persons that we must infer some strong necessity it subserves, such as we see in sexual attraction. Egotism, or its better form, confidence, plays a role in providing energies for creativity. But it must ultimately be overcome if one is to become poetic or more generally creative in the most powerful ways. As Emerson put it in art, his essay Art, so much as we can shove aside our egotism, our prejudice and will, and bring the omniscience of reason upon the subject before us, so perfect is the work. I'm reminded of Jackson Browne's line in a song he wrote about his youth growing up, and he was in Laurel Canyon with all of the now famous and mostly dying musicians of the day, from the Monkees to Joni Mitchell, to Crosby, Stills, and Nash. They're all living on this one hillside. And in the song, he writes about among those there to test, right, their fortunes and their wills. And he says, I lost track of the score long ago, but the point is that the music that they made became good in a lot of ways, but it was often tainted by the egos that were involved in the process. You have to read the history of it to see that, but it's there. Every day, said Thoreau, is a good day if we but know what to do with it. Such knowledge is not easy to come by. I must be able to perceive the meanings possible in the day. Living through the pretensions of convention, place, power, position, and the past will yield only more pretension. We must relinquish our pretensions in any attempt to own our own premises and visions. Even if my ideas in the end match the conventions, they are not mine until I think to own them. If I get my premises on loan or by imitation, they will not sustain my commitment. They will evaporate when push comes to shove. For Emerson, such is not a philosophical life. Premises on loan can be left at the professional workplace and needn't bother me elsewhere. Let us then rethink thinking in an Emersonian vein, noting as we go some affinities with the subsequent pragmatic tradition. In our logic books, we teach the distinction between argument and inference. The first is form, the latter process. But we do not take this distinction seriously enough. We inveterately link inference to deductive form. Indeed, throughout much of the 19th and 20th centuries, many philosophers continued to seek ways to reduce induction to deduction. On their grounds, without certainty, one had no knowledge. So the game was to find a way to squeeze certainty, or what they called confirmation. Most of you are not old enough to go back to confirmation theory, but it was a huge thing in the 50s and 60s. And it was an attempt to use deduction to solve all the puzzles. And interestingly, A.J. Ayer said in the 1930s that we would have that done by the year 2000. He later got religion and then died. So they wanted to squeeze certainty and what they called confirmation out of inductive processes. And anyone who studies induction knows that that doesn't happen. Thinkers like Peirce and James thought such a project was a dead end. As a result, Peirce loosened the linkage between inferring and deductive form. But in Emerson's work, and later in James's work, this bond was nearly broken altogether. Form was the window dressing laid over the thinking of primary experience and knowing by acquaintance. And it's interesting that a lot of the neo-pragmatists and later 20th century analytic folks dismiss the idea of knowledge by acquaintance. They literally reject it as possibility. I have a longer story to tell about that. I have a paper that's linked to this one that I wrote about kayaking, surfing, and whitewater kayaking and surfing and other serious water sports and its relation to how do you know the water. And when I sent the paper over to a guy in England who was going to publish it in a book, he said, how can you have knowledge without concepts? And the answer was, go kayaking, right? Go surfing. You'll find the answer in the experience. And yet, the idea that when you get set up in such a formal structure, it's like the tar baby, you can't find your way out. So deduction remained for them a significant mode of inference, but it was neither the only mode nor the most significant. Most importantly, they argued that it should not be made a model for the thinking that both logically and experientially precedes it. So deduction should not be the model for how you get the premises for doing deductions. That's the problem. For Emerson, we humans are inferencing animals, and our inferencing begins in our perceiving of the world. As for Peirce and James later, for Emerson, perception is a continuous process that yields things as well as relations, facts as well as meanings. Perception involves its own mode of inarticulate judgment. Thus, the vision of intellect, quote, is not like the vision of the eye, but is in union with things known. Consider in this vein James's claim that sensing and sensed are simply two aspects of one experience. Our thinking as perceiving inferencing leads itself from thought to thought, from where we are now to new grounds and premises. In deduction, we are led by relations of inclusion and exclusion. In induction, we are led by abstraction, prediction, and experimental testing. For Emerson, our most aboriginal thinking is led by analogizing and associating. For Emerson, association was not merely a psychological description, but a normed activity that can be performed well or ill. This is akin to Peircean abduction. And the efficacy of analogy is to be found in perceiving, and it is tested in experiencing. We must learn to be good observers. Right? We're all naturally capable of observing, but we're not good observers. We need to learn it. And if you've ever been to a grocery store that's busy, you will know that from the people in the aisle who don't know that you're trying to get through. Right? They're inattentive to what's happening. Again, logic for Emerson is the procession or proportionate unfolding of the intuition. Hegel and Peirce said much the same, as I know, at least my reading of the two. As I noted at the outset, Emerson asked us to leave our egotism at the door when we seek to know or to learn. At the same time, he was well aware of the difficulty of doing this and offered some suggestions. The antidotes to this organic egotism are the range and variety of attractions as gained by acquaintance with the world, with men of merit, let's call that persons of merit, with classes of society, with travel, with eminent persons, and with the high resources of philosophy, art, religion, books, travel, society, solitude. In short, a wider range of natural cultural experiences helps put us in our place. This is the familiar use of a liberal and thus a liberating education. As later did Peirce, Emerson believed that a commitment to truth, not to ourselves, would help soften our egotism and put us in a better position to learn. The lover of truth, he argued, will abstain from dogmatism. However, for this initial move toward an attitude of receptivity in the art of thinking, Emerson offered neither a recipe nor a set of rules, both of which would have been contrary to his very notion of the intellect. Instead, again, as did Peirce later in his consideration of the process of abduction, he offered some basic and non-exhaustive experiential strategies. The receptivity of the intellect is not merely passive. We must find ways to bring ourselves to a receptive mood or attitude. One such way in human cultures has been to seek solitude, and Emerson traded heavily on this throughout his work, as did his friend Thoreau. And again, the interesting thing is people think of Thoreau as wandering around in the woods. He was highly educated. He could translate Greek and Latin. He understood economics of the time. He was not a dummy. And he was not I don't know how people like to think of him, but the move to Walden Pond was about this, about learning how to think and be receptive. And that comes clear if you read past the first two chapters of Walden, you will see that by the time you get to the end of Sounds and the end of the essays, you will see that it's very clear what he's up to. Most of us don't get that far in the book. We usually read the first two essays and leave it there. There's a chapter named Reading in Walden, which one should pay attention to. So, however, for this initial move, an attitude of receptivity and the art of thinking, Emerson offered neither a recipe nor a set of rules. I've done that. Seeking solitude stands in the tradition of the Epicureans, Philo's Therapeutae, and the aesthetic soul healing of John Cassian. One aim is to reduce the interferences to our receptivity, to clear away space in which we might find ourselves and learn to let things be. And this was in part Thoreau's task at Walden Pond. But the end game was never for Thoreau or Emerson to live in hermitage. The hope was that solitude might yield the conditions for awakening or for learning, in Emerson's case, for thinking well. In short, to stand in solitude was to engage in a discipline that might help us think, to find and found the grounds and premises for our own worlds. And if you look at John Cassian and the early Roman Catholic monks in their retreats, this is what they were up to as well. Perhaps in a different way, but it was a spiritual journey of finding truths. Little is said these days about the uses of contemplation and meditation, which are modes of the receptive attitude. And indeed, by 1920, John Dewey was arguing in Reconstruction and Philosophy that these were outmoded forms of thinking for the experimental work of the sciences and presumably of philosophy. And this is where I parted company with Dewey many, many years ago. Having read that book, which most Deweyians claim is the most important book that John Dewey wrote, I think it's the most off-centered of Dewey's books, and for a variety of reasons, but that is one of them.
Reconstruction. Which one is the most off-centered?
Reconstruction.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did I mention another one?
Yeah, but I'm just making sure
okay.
everybody here hears.
I think that Dewey was badly wrong in this score, and that we in philosophy have tended to follow that lead rather blindly, without even stopping to explore our own experiences of thinking. Empirical science, Emerson worried, is apt to cloud the sight, and by the very knowledge of functions and processes to bereave the student of the manly contemplation of the whole. The upshot has been a radical inattentiveness, not to the formal structures of inference and the consequences of our beliefs, but to the origination of the premises on which we conduct our thought and live our lives. In contrast, Emerson believed the contemplative and meditative moods enabled by solitude were extremely useful in helping us become good perceivers of facts and meanings. The good naturalist, Emerson argued, will see that there are far more excellent qualities in the student than preciseness and infallibility, that a guess is often more fruitful than an indisputable affirmation, and that a dream may let us deeper into the secret of nature than 100 concerted experiments. His aim was not to reject experiment, but to remind us that all experiments operate on some working confluence of grounds and premises. We don't experiment from nowhere. A second Emersonian suggestion for finding an attitude of receptivity was that we should engage directly with our natural settings. In recent years, Richard Rorty often repeated the premise of his linguistic pragmatism, and I quote, "Nature does not speak." This was not Emerson's view, and unless one is committed a priori to Rorty's claim, it is not likely the way most of us would think of our own experiences. In Peircean terms, at the very least, nature resists us all the time in its various modes of secondness. I still can't fly when exiting the third story of a window. I think it is at least worth reconsidering Emerson's belief that we are in continuous engagement with nature. That is the not me of our experiences. And that could be in cities as well as the woods. Our very vocabulary, Emerson argued, in nature, the first nature, grows out of our analogizing inferencing. Right means straight, wrong means twisted, spirit primarily means wind, transgression, the crossing of a line, supercilious, the raising of an eyebrow, who looks upon a river in a meditative hour and is not reminded of the flux of all things. Throw a stone into the stream and the circles that propagate themselves are the beautiful type of all influence, the little ripples that go out into the world. In his second nature essay, Emerson pushed even further and pointed to the ways in which nature instructed us in what Thoreau called higher laws. Our egotism is shamed in the presence of nature. I am taught, Emerson said, the poorness of our invention, the ugliness of our towns and palaces. However impressive our pyramids and Sistine chapels, they are dwarfed by the powers of beauty found in the encounter with the Grand Canyon or Yosemite, or pick any number of other places in the universe. We become nature's students, expanding the range of our cultural education, and our art is seen then to be natural as well. Thus in art does nature work through the will of a man filled with the beauty of her first works. This ability of nature to judge us and to teach us, I have always taken to be the central point of Emerson's most famous passage. Crossing a bare common in snow puddles at twilight under a clouded sky, without having in my thoughts any occurrence of a special good fortune, I have enjoyed a perfect exhilaration. I am glad to the brink of fear. And if you've never experienced that, I encourage you to go find a storm somewhere and take a walk in it. It's just amazing. I used to run in hurricanes. It's amazing. In the woods, we return to reason and faith. And there I feel that nothing can befall me in life. No disgrace, no calamity, leaving me my eyes, which nature cannot repair. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into space, all mean egotism vanishes. Nature shames us, judges us, and instructs us. Nature takes us out of ourselves and, in Thoreau's language, brings us to our senses. All this is a way of getting us ready to learn something. The final importance of nature in its speaking is that it is our environment. It presses in on us, it enables us, it assists us. It is that to which we must be attentive if we are to get around and if we are to acquire what William James, borrowing from John Rote, called knowing by acquaintance. To argue a priori, as Rote did, that language barricades us from nature is to argue that we cannot learn from experience. Not only will we be divorced from sympathetic engagements with nature and our social settings, but we will have no reason to study history and our cultural diversity, which for Emerson are also features of our natural environment. History, like the woods, is a ready antidote to the arrogance of the present. To read Thomas Kuhn or Wilfrid Sellars and not hear the muffled thought of Peirce is to miss much of what is going on. To see that what I think Pascal, Margaret Fuller, Sappho, and Plato have already thought is to relinquish my copyright. And for Emerson, it is only by releasing my copyright, by overcoming my ego's desire for control and recognition, that I can get rightly oriented to think. Too many APA stories come to mind when I hear that line. Some people are driven by fame in the smallest of places. Moreover, if Rote is right, the reading of books will not be instructive. We will read, but only for our private pleasure and not for learning, which he actually says in Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity. It's edifying, it's not educating. Rote thus provides us with an excellent description of philosophical practice of the last century, but his view on its own grounds tells us nothing, especially nothing of practical value, concerning how inferencing animals have come to know and to learn about their worlds. Creating a receptive attitude is thus difficult work. We need to remain awake, alert, and focused. At the same time, we cannot be dominating, controlling, and leading. We must learn patience. As Peirce pointed out in his description of amusement as strategy for the process of abduction, ideas take time. The intellect must allow an incipient idea, a feeling, to transact with it until it becomes into focus. The oracle comes, Emerson said, because we had previously laid siege to the shrine. And the most obvious feature of laying siege is the ability to wait it out. As inferencing proceeds, we engage in an unstable dialectic. We wait and we receive, and we will work in turns. So now he says, you must labor with your brains, and now you must forbear your activity, and see what the great soul showeth. The clarity and efficiency of deductive reasoning, no matter how complex or how intricate, is a luxury and fills only a small role in our actual inferencing lives. I am convinced that it achieved its modeling status on the basis of the narrow aesthetic of symmetry that grew from formalist readings of Christian creation into the worship of geometry among the moderns. This fetish for symmetry seems hardly appropriate to an organic and evolutionary-minded time. For Emerson, even if one's hope is to arrive at the clarity and distinctness of formal reasoning, one cannot do so without first laying down the grounds and premises on which one must live and think. Long prior to the age of reflection, he argued, is the thinking of the mind. Our dialectic warns us to beware of two extremes, merely passive receptivity and the arbitrary overdetermination of our private wills. I quote again, our truth of thought is therefore vitiated as much by too violent direction given by our will as by too great a negligence. This brief excursion into Emerson's thinking leads me to close with a sketch of several tentative upshots. 1, philosophy is not essentially debate. Debate is simply one of the things a philosopher is able to do. Rather, philosophy is a thinking that leads into genuine conversation with others equally interested in truth or beauty or goodness. I mean, this is classic Aristotle from the Metaphysics. Nobody wants to read the last book. Or if they do, they're not doing it in a way that's being brought forward to the importance of things like not arguing with vegetables. So philosophy is the thinking that leads into genuine conversation with others equally interested in truth or beauty or goodness. But for this very reason, it is extremely difficult to find. Over the course of my career at Penn State, I had Karl Vaught and one of my grad students, Pete Groff, and maybe one or two other people that I could actually have philosophical conversations with and not just debates. And that shouldn't be the case. We should be looking grounds. We should not be egotists. We should not be trying to win the debate, but to learn something about the truth. So it hinges on living trust in one's interlocutors. As William James put it, philosophical discussion proper only succeeds between intimates who have learned how to converse by months of weary trials and failure. The philosopher is a lone beast dwelling in his individual burrow. The difficulty is in finding and then sharing one's grounds of living. 2, philosophy plays for keeps in the conduct of life. I have always been amazed at the passions that are generated in what we call professional philosophical settings. The hidden issue is that to which Emerson directs us. It's not about the argument, but about the premises. Even if we remain blind to the fact, our ideas are our modes of living. They constitute our actualities and possibilities. This means that every challenge to our thinking, as John William Miller said years ago, is ad hominem. To challenge my ideas is to challenge my ways of being. 3, even as philosophy plays for keeps and lives with commitments, it must remain experimental. This has been perhaps the most difficult trial of the last century of philosophy. How can one be morally or aesthetically committed without finality and certainty? Emerson's point is that this is where we find ourselves. It's not a matter of what you want. This is where we are. And that's the road we have to stand on. The importance of the receptive mood, of the breadth of experience and culture, is that we get beyond our egotism and dogmatism. Our inferencing is experimental at its origin. Analogizing and associating do not yield certainty. And if we remain blind to our egotism and ignorant of our historically inherited beliefs, we cannot even get to the point of reception that might allow us to refresh our grounds and premises. For Emerson, our thinking is always unfinished business. He is the thinker of circles. We must live with some self-aversion that we might on occasion meet with some self-recovery. And finally, for Emerson, a corollary of this last thought is that the guiding higher law of philosophy and intellect is amelioration. And that's all we get in a world that isn't final. Let us return in closing to the seemingly straightforward social activism of Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. She did not begin with theory and argumentation. She learned an experiential vocabulary from her natural and social environment: poverty, exclusion, hunger, emptiness, suffering. In these natural facts, she found the meanings of injustice, dishonesty, and imbalance, thereby revealing the higher laws of justice, honesty, and harmony. These facts and laws became the grounds upon which she lived her life. Nature and culture provided her a platform of perspective from which to see that these were not her idiosyncratic beliefs. These ideas warranted her working commitment and provided a place from which to launch her criticism, as well as her productive and constructive labors. Hers was the poetry of a world of fairness, inclusion, and hope. Her life and her thinking were ameliorative. This is the often overlooked element in Emerson's story of receptivity. The lawyer is thought more useful and more practical than the intellect, the thinker. The lawyer studies, follows, and learns to manipulate the rules. But the rules are derivative from other premises and become essentially restrictive and conservative. They are meant to constrain and to mechanize the thinker. For Emerson, it is only through the difficult work of the intellect receptive that we can most fully begin to improve our worlds. "'Tis inhuman," Emerson wrote, "to want faith in the power of education, since to ameliorate is the law of nature, and men are valued precisely as they exert onward or ameliorating force." I judge Elizabeth Gurley Flynn in just this fashion. It's not about whether she was a communist, whether she was in my party, or whether I even agree with her means. She exerted an onward and ameliorating force. For those familiar with the history of ideas and cultures, this is certainly not a new conception of a philosophical life and practice. But it is a conception that will have to work to find its own sort of purchase in 2026. In our professional settings, the task will even be more difficult. Everyone wants to own philosophy, proper by assertion, just to exclude the others, whoever they are. And yet, despite A.J. Ayer's best efforts, I find no knockdown proofs of the meaning of philosophy on the grounds where we presently find ourselves. And Emerson would ask us to think again. That's all.
I'm quite sure that Doug can handle his own questions.
You got certainty about that?
No.
Yeah.
I guess my sort of question is, you mentioned, that there's difference between a debate and a philosophical conversation. I'm curious, and you told me, the sort of the prerequisites of having it, but I'm curious, like, what the actual differences in the conversation could be. Like what would what would a philosophical conversation sound like versus a debate?
Well, the debaters on both sides are trying to win, right? So they will cheat. I mean, if you study the history of rhetoric in the Middle Ages, it's all about cheating. It's all about learning how to sell a house. So that's pretty clear difference. The other is you don't trust your opponent, right? In a debate, you got an opponent. In a conversation, you have a friend. And there's a very different thing. And this is what Aristotle said. The only time you could philosophize openly in public was when he had someone he could trust and have a conversation with. And I think the kicker is that you have to be willing to change your mind. You have to be willing to see that there's something to learn. Right? And if you're not willing to learn, you're not thinking. You're not receptive. You're not open. So I think, I can't. When you experience one, you will know the difference. That's for sure. And if you go to some philosophy meetings, you will see the difference, even if you're not engaged in the conversations. And I can name you the philosophers that I can have a conversation with philosophically and the ones I can't. Dick Rorty, you couldn't, not because he wasn't a nice guy. He was a very shy guy, and he was a nice guy, but he was stuck. And that's odd for the guy who wrote the book to get over analytic philosophy. He just couldn't get past that everything is language. He was extremely dogmatic in that respect. And so you couldn't have an argument about the very grounds of things with Dick. There are philosophers out there with whom Arnie Ness would have been one of them. He's dead now. I don't know, maybe others can think of some actually reflect. I mean, Foucault. People get, there was a cult of Foucault, but Foucault was not the cult himself. He went all over the place. He found Hadot and brought him forward, and he learned from Hadot. Right? So this was this guy who was doing all this crazy, wonderful scholarship about the ancients and the early medieval thinkers. And Foucault said, wow, there's something here I've got to learn. And if you're Foucault, and if you know Foucault's work, he is extremely learned. Right? And I'm not a fan of everything Foucault wrote, but he would have been somebody who could have this. Derrida, no. Derrida just listened to himself talk all day long. And that's all he did. He wouldn't have a conversation in public or private that I know of. I wasn't there for enough of the private side to know that for sure, but his public persona was not one where you could carry on that kind of conversation. So hopefully you will experience. Maybe you already have experience with friends. Because philosophical conversations don't come with a big P. They come with, what should we be doing on the weekend? And all of a sudden some ontological issues arise, or moral issues, or aesthetic issues. Yeah.
You mentioned the importance of learning to be an observer, and I don't know if you heard of second order cybernetics.
Nope.
But
Well, I mean, I've heard of cybernetics, but I don't know what second
Second
order.
order cybernetics is including the observer in their science of cybernetics. Cybernetics. And they actually teach people how to be good observers so that you can actually look at a system and almost sort of be removed from it and be able to watch it. So there are sciences now that are starting to teach observation, because you're right, you're so right, to be able to remove yourself, to be able to observe, as to keep learning. And appreciate you saying that.
Yeah, well, that's something good for me to learn, but I think a lot of naturalists come to it that way. Somebody like, well, I don't know, Aldo Leopold was someone who was a scientist but also an experiencer. And his experiences changed his, I mean, the having to shoot the wolf for Aldo Leopold changed his whole outlook on life. It was a philosophical moment. We never call it philosophy, but that was an experience that changed the direction of his entire career as a scientist. So yeah, I take that as something I should go read about.
For your talk.
Yeah.
You mentioned excuse me. You mentioned Arne-Ness, which he and the deep ecology people almost never ever get talked about. And I just kind of was wondering if you could expound on Ness, and maybe also part two of my question. Are you familiar with Peter Besselzopf? Because he was a huge influence on Ness, and he's an existentialist that never gets talked about.
No, I mean, my encounter with Ness is strictly through the deep ecology movement and his writings. And he was driven by experiences. You know, a lot of people would say he was a dogmatist, but I think, again, it's hard to sort out sometimes who's what. But in the ways I heard him speak, in the ways that he wrote, he was open to various ways of dealing with the issues, but he didn't want to deny the issues. And he undertook a lot of the practices Emerson talks about, the solitude. He built his little house in the mountain in Norway. But he was also out in the public and doing a lot of the Burley Flynn kind of activism as well. So no, I haven't heard of who's the name?
Peter Besselzopf.
Yeah.
He's got this book called On the Tragic. It just got translated into English from Norwegian.
Well, then I should be able to read it, because I can't read Norwegian. Yeah. So that would be another good thing for me to learn. So. But Ness just, he's not talked about in philosophy because he's not considered to be a philosopher, but neither is Emerson. So. North Thoreau. Or Margaret Fuller, by the way, I'm going to do my Margaret Fuller plug. She is the most overlooked philosopher in American history. She's an incredible mind, and we just ignore it. Too bad. I can talk with your mentor. I can have a philosophical conversation with him.
I think so.
Yeah.
When you say Margaret Fuller is the most overlooked, I certainly don't disagree with you. But what is it about Margaret Fuller that that leads you to have this exalted opinion of her? I mean, I understand you've got a singular philosophical individual, but what ideas or idea would you point to that we could really learn from?
Well, I always have to select some because there are a lot.
Yeah, sure.
Well, first of all, I mean, if you go back and look at the history of the Transcendentalists, she was the only one who understood most of what was going on because the others were stuck in their ways. And she was the outsider. And this comes back to the whole thing here. I mean, one of the things that Enrique Dussel argues is that most of the best ideas that we have in the world have always come from the poor people, from the outside, because they're the ones who are experiencing the very things that need to be fixed, that need to be ameliorated. So she had a gender scale, a spectrum on gender. Some of us are, we can say masculine, feminine, but all of us are stuck on the spectrum in different ways in different places. Like nobody is wholly masculine, nobody's wholly feminine. That's a pretty interesting thought in 1840s. Her understanding of what was going on with Emerson and Parker and the other Transcendentalists is clear. She was well trained in the history of thought, art, poetry, and brought that to bear on her conversations with the world. I think the reason people don't like to read her is because she has so many allusions to things they haven't read or don't know. And that's really been the problem. They think she's an elitist. Well, she wasn't an elitist. She was at home learning from her father and reading on her own and learning. And she did. She started a school for young women to teach them how to get out of. She did activism in Boston for women's, we call it rights these days, but for the betterment of women.
Didn't she start a reading group?
She
to help
started a
all the
reading
women
group,
in the
yes,
community
with
learn
all the
their
women,
ideas?
and they were freed to actually think about what they wanted to think about for a change. So it's very radical for 1840, and yet she was included enough to be able to see the other side. She knew what the men were up to, and she knew what the problems were for the women. And I mean, she was one of the first to do sociological studies of imprisoned hookers. And she went up to Sing Sing and had conversations and wrote down these stories about these women who had been imprisoned because they were, women of the night, and trying to figure out what has happened to them and why are they being imprisoned for something that men are doing, which hasn't changed. Right? ED is a medical case, but pregnancy isn't. What the hell is that about? Yeah. Go ahead.
I wonder if you can say something about the role of philosophy and the philosopher from this Emersonian perspective, given the social media age that we find ourselves in, because it seems like even everyday people have access to just use an image that is not based in experience to be able to project not only a sense of themselves, but what truth is. I think like a lot of students or a lot of children who are growing up nowadays learn that they can manipulate and live outside of experience through these images. And so I'm wondering then what the role of philosophy is given
Yeah,
the level
well,
of
it's interesting you say outside of experience, because they are experiencing.
Yes, they are
And the
experiencing.
question is, what is the nature of the experience? And it's certainly, for the most part, as you say, manipulate is not receptive, right? And the negative way of being receptive is to be a follower of anything, TikTok or Twitch, or you go and be a follower or a blog, you could just get stuck following everything, which means you don't have time or energy to create. So I think that's one issue, but go ahead.
I mean, I'm more to the point that you were talking about how experience, if you're receptive enough that you can learn from it.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
partly what they're doing within experience is they're abstracting parts of who they are to project a certain kind of image that's a false image of who they are and how they live their lives. But that's where truth is now for most younger generations. It's in this image and not actually in the kind of experience that you were talking about.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering then, what is the role of philosophy and philosophers given the level of technology and the access of technology that youth have?
Well, I don't think it's any different than it was in Athens, the role of the philosopher. And that is, first of all, I don't think there's any one role. If we call it a profession, maybe it's a role of teaching philosophy. I don't think there's any one role. And I would need to be careful because I think there are ways of being receptive online that exposes all of the things you're worried about. So it would be possible. But this comes back to, in part, what Emerson says about education and what Dewey says about education. Education, not indoctrination. And maybe that's the reason Dewey puts this at the basis of his philosophical thinking, is that it's the most critical thing. So we should certainly, whether you're a philosopher or not, little p philosophers, right, thinking about the world, we should be teaching people to think. And to teach them to think is to lead them to think. It's not to tell them how to think. So I think there are a lot of roles that you could do this on TikTok, but you'd have to be very careful about how you do it because you don't need cults. You don't need followers. And I think, you see that at the APA meetings. That's one of the worst problems at APA meetings is some clown walking down the hallway and 10 little Indians following him. And it's just, is not a good way to think about how we think. So if you have children, you would think about this in a different way. And you'd want to be philosophically minded. Getting people to live philosophically is not an easy task. Heidegger was aware of that, Emerson's aware of that, Socrates was aware of that. So I don't think the role has changed. Your task is to try to ask questions to get people to find their way. And the ways are all different for all of us. But if we don't reflect on what they could be, what the possibilities are, if we don't reflect on what some obvious disasters are, we'll never get past what you're worried about. Right? We start at age 2, 3, 4, 5 with the screen, and we're stuck there, and we create false images of ourselves. And one of the things, what's the key Socratic moment? Learn who you are and become who you are. And that's a process that evolves throughout the course of a lifetime. So I need to be careful how I'm trying to express this. I don't think the philosopher is any one person, any one thing. I think it's an attitude and an orientation that can come out in a variety of ways. It can be expressed in a variety of ways. So I'm not opposed to somebody using hip hop for philosophy. I'm not opposed to using somebody country music for philosophy. I'm not opposed to somebody using a dinner as a philosophical text, as a way of thinking about how we should be living our lives. So I don't want to narrow it too much, but I'm aware of what you're worried about, I think, what you're worried about. And that's not going to change. I mean, in the early 1800s, the worry was, the world's gone to hell because we've got novels, right? and romantic poets, Byron. And people thought, oh, if the children read this, they're going to fall off the edge of the world. And I think many do. When I fall off the edge of the world, it's become confined to 40 years of working in a factory or being a lawyer or whatever it is, and then dying without being reflective about that existence. So I think it's difficult, but I think young people can be led to experiences. I think old people can be led to experiences. It's a harder task because we're less malleable. But, anybody here seen the Grand Canyon? Anybody think you can tell the story to somebody else? Exactly what that's like? And the answer is, we can say all we want until you see it. You don't have that feeling.
You don't get it.
You don't get that expressed feeling in the sense. Same with musics. It can be any of those things. So you asked me a hard question. I don't have an easy answer, and I want to be careful about the answer of what I think. Because I know we're not going to throw out the phones. I know we're not going to throw out the computers. And I know TikTok's going to be there. So what do we do now? And as a philosopher, I would, and you guys know in my classrooms, yell and shout and scream and say, wake up, and sort of indirectly.
And it seems that philosophy's on the wane, right?
What's that?
And it seems institutionally that philosophy.
Oh yeah, philosophy, and why is that? Because there are a number of reasons, but one of them is we made ourselves absolutely irrelevant, except for people who like to play video games. We're really good at it. The Twitch people love philosophy. And it's because it's a technical game that we've created in the 20th century. And that doesn't mean some of it is not important, because it was talking about real issues. But again, my experiences at these meetings is that people just want to beat each other up. My good friend good friend in quotation marks down in Vanderbilt, he's a jackass. He's a smart jackass, but he's a jackass. He doesn't care about the truth.
No, we're talking about Rob or Scott or
Both.
both.
They're basically the same dude.
Same dudes, right?
Yeah, and they're both smart, but they have no sense, no aesthetic sense in a philosophical way. And that's the danger. Right? That's the danger of saying, well, philosophers can fix everything. Because we can't. Right? The ripples, the education, getting over our egotism, getting young people to not be egotistical or want fame and fortune over truth, those are difficult tasks in any generation. It was difficult for Socrates and got him killed. It was difficult for John Dewey and William James. They got excluded from the canon. Emerson, Thoreau, Fuller, all of them excluded. Not to mention, right, Du Bois, Fanon. You can go down the road, and if you ask Tommy Curry, there's a list that's a mile long that none of us white guys ever thought about reading, and we should be. So there's danger all over the place, but I think so Tommy Curry's Ripples. Right? A lot of people don't like Tommy because he's a hard ass. And maybe he's a little arrogant. He always said he could beat me in tennis. I don't think he could back then. Maybe he could now. But he taught me a lot, right? Just by exposing me to things I didn't know and hadn't read. And that experientially I hadn't experienced, right? And will never have experienced. But I can begin to see through that lens things that I need to learn. And I think that's radically important. I think in some ways you and my friend Lehman Basil are in the same kind of way of teaching me things that I could not have known. And experientially, you have things to say to me that I will never get, right, directly. But I can learn from that, and I can learn to begin to see the world differently. Right? Because of Lehman, I see Ferguson very differently than I would have seen it if I hadn't known it. Right? It would have been this external political struggle. When I hear him tell about the streets and how he lived and how it went, I learn significant things experientially, vicariously, about what I ought to be thinking. So those little ripples that Emerson talks about, I think are the most crucial thing for philosophers. And by philosophers, I mean people who live philosophically, open to truth, open to changing minds, open to learning, no matter how old we get. I mean, if you had known me, any of you had known me, well, certainly 50 years ago, radically different human, radically different. I mean,
Almost 50, not quite.
well, you've seen the changes. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
we just, I mean, getting stuck in a role, professional philosopher, professional sociologist, whatever it is, doctor, lawyer, getting stuck in those roles can be very dangerous because we begin to see ourselves, like you said, the little kids creating false images. That's how we adults do it, right? I'm a lawyer, right? Don't fuck with me. And it's not a philosophical life. And if it were easy, Socrates wouldn't have been killed, and maybe Athens would have had a different history. If it were easy, Aristotle wouldn't have moved out. If it were easy, then you can name half of the Roman Catholic philosophers of the Middle Ages. They all got excommunicated at one time or another. And even Aquinas was under threat for reading Avicenna. So, and Galileo. And so I don't think you've asked me, again, I'd say a very difficult question. And what I'm trying to get at is living philosophically is more important than being a philosopher. Maybe that's a better way to put it. And living philosophically for me, being receptive to learning. And in the process of educating, I don't tell you what to think. I say, here's my experiences and how it goes for me. We have an exchange. And then we move down the road and see who's been changed by whom. So think of all your mentors. Anybody, think of your mentors. How did they change you? And I don't mean, they didn't take your arm, right, and bend it and say, you got to be a philosophy teacher or whatever it is. Somehow they had an effect on you. Your best teachers will have effects on you. And those are the ripples I think philosophers should be engaged in. I don't know how else to put it in a more succinct way, something like that.
Well, that seems like a pretty good place to draw this to a close.
One
Oh,
one
Corny.
sidebar comment, a little bit of a sidebar comment. Some of my earlier comments before you arrived here were concepts and ideas of Buckminster Fuller. People might be surprised to learn that Margaret Fuller was his great aunt.
Yeah, that's right.
I didn't know that.
You didn't know that?
No.
Buckminster Fuller.
you see-
Margaret Fuller was Buckminster Fuller's great aunt?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
So, we'll
Yeah.
put all full circle.
And speaking of creative minds, we had one right here in the 70s. Very creative.
Right here.
All right. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you.